Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Grace Lutheran Podcast. This is Pastor Matt Neupel, and I am so glad that you tuned into our program today as we discuss different issues and topics about our faith and lives in Jesus Christ. And if you're listening and you're in the Winston-Salem area looking for a church that offers traditional, Christ-centered worship and is able to accommodate different concerns about COVID or social distancing, you are always invited to join us every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. at the Hayworth Miller Chapel in Advance. Before we begin, I have just a couple of announcements to pass along. First, we have our first council meeting of 2021 this Saturday. We have 4 new council members joining us, so we're really excited about this time of transition and fresh start at Grace. So we ask for prayer as we encourage our new council officers in their call to serve in this capacity, but we also want to give thanks for our council members who have already served in this way. Next, I wanted to announce that we're going to be offering a modified Ash Wednesday service at 3 different times at our Broy Hill Fellowship Hall. This is going to be a short service of prayer, imposition of ashes, and a brief message as we begin the season of Lent on February 17th. Unfortunately, due to limited space in our fellowship hall and with social distancing concerns at the Broy Hill Center, seating and standing room is going to be limited. So we're asking members and visitors to sign up for one of the 3 available services, either the morning service at 8 a.m., the noon service at 12, or the evening service at 6 p.m. Sign-ups will be available this Sunday, either in person before our service, on our Facebook page, or via email if you're a current member of Grace. That's all I have for announcements, so why don't we get into today's topic? So in looking at our previous episodes, I realize a lot of our past topics have been kind of abstract, dealing with things like feast days, the Blessed Virgin Mary. So today I wanted to shift gears and talk about something that may seem a little bit more practical. If you've already read the title, you've seen that we're going to be talking about a Christian approach to media today. But I think that needs some clarification because by media, I don't mean just the mainstream media outlets that we think of, such as CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. To me, media includes any kind of outlet of information that impresses upon us a way to see the world around us. To me, this includes everything from the books that we read to the YouTube channels that we subscribe to. Everything from the music that we listen to the artwork that we see hanging in galleries. All of these could be considered examples of media. Now, of course, there may be some forms of media that have more power to influence us, such as social media or mass media. But everything that impresses upon us a particular worldview or a way of seeing things can be, in a way, considered media. With this in mind, the topic of media becomes a pretty broad topic very quickly. So we're going to approach this topic under 2 admittedly broad categories of entertainment and social media. If this is something that interests a lot of our listeners, maybe we can unpack more of what it means to approach media in the future. But I believe this is at least a good starting point for us to begin this topic of a Christian interaction with media around us. First, I think we need to dispel this common myth in our culture that the media we consume, things like movies, TV shows, music, there's this pervasive myth in our culture that tells us that these things don't have a direct impact on how we view the world. In America, we've tried to do a good job of separating business from entertainment or pleasure. But as a result, I think this has caused this attitude of believing that there's no way possible that the movies we watch could affect our work performance, or that it's ridiculous to think that the music we listen to could somehow impact our politics. While I think it is ridiculous to, for example, blame a school shooting on a video game, I also think it's ridiculous to respond to that by saying that video games have absolutely no impact on a person's worldview. Whether we recognize it going on or not, media is always presenting us with new information in ways that challenge us to either accept or reject that information. To make this point, I like to use the example of young kids, especially those between the ages of 4 and 8. If you observe children around this age, you notice pretty quickly that nearly everything they say and do is informed by the media that they consume. Whether it's from the bedtime stories that they're used to hearing from their parents at night, or the movies that they've watched, it's common to see them mimic or imitate the things that they've seen and heard from the media around them. I believe even as adults, we still have this sponge-like brain when it comes to the media around us. But as we've gotten older, we've just gotten a lot better at hiding it. So it's important we begin this discussion of media on the point that any kind of media that we're confronted with, whether it's a story or a piece of news, is always challenging us to see the world from a particular point of view. We can either accept that point of view and go along for the ride, or we can say no thanks and keep on walking. But we're better aware of this choice when we see the effect that the media can have on our way of thinking. With this in mind, we can respond to how the media affects us in two different ways. On one hand, we could respond in the way that I believe the majority of the American church has responded historically, and that is by changing the media into a purely Christian enterprise. Jerry Falwell Sr., the great evangelical leader of the 20th century, famously said that if something is Christian, that it should be better, implying that Christians should be devoting themselves to Christian music, Christian art, Christian forms of things that society already offered. This began the memorable cultural trend of the 80s and 90s from a lot of evangelical churches that sought to create Christian versions of a lot of things that were popular within the culture at that time. Personally, one of the most amusing examples of this was Guitar Praise, the Christian version of the video game Guitar Hero. I don't want the focus of this video to be on the criticisms I have of these forms of media, but I primarily want to focus on why I don't believe this attitude of just transforming the media to just be explicitly Christian in everything that it does. Why I don't believe that that's the right approach for us as Christians to be taking. To be clear, I don't believe there's anything wrong with wanting to surround oneself with Christian forms of media like art and music. Those are all good things that we should seek after and want to appreciate. But there's also nothing wrong with, and in fact I believe we're invited to, appreciate forms of media that we often consider secular. For example, my girlfriend Laura and I have recently been watching this TV show called The Mandalorian. Now, I've never really been a huge Star Wars fan, but what I appreciate about this show is how the creator, Jon Favreau, incorporates a lot of classic film elements from old Western movies, old Japanese samurai films. Laura likes it for other reasons, but it's been something that we've been able to bond over, and it's given us something to look forward to watching together on a weekly basis. Even though I'm the pastor of a church, I can tell you that this is one of my favorite TV shows that's currently running right now, but there's nothing in The Mandalorian that is explicitly Christian. No one ever preaches the gospel on The Mandalorian. No one announces the forgiveness of sins offered through Christ on this TV show. But that doesn't necessarily mean a show like The Mandalorian is directing us away from or is somehow against our commitment to follow Christ as a word and sacrament community. Some of the greatest artists and entertainers of the past few decades have been people who were not Christians. But I believe as the church, we can find the degree of truth that is found in the beauty that those artists and entertainers are participating in. This is why I try to avoid broad, generalized, fundamentalist rules when it comes to the media that we consume. For example, vague rules such as we shouldn't watch movies with too much violence or too much nudity. Of course, we should be avoiding things that teach us to glorify death or pornography. But I don't see how a film like Saving Private Ryan, for instance, could have been as impactful as it was had it not been for the graphic violence and some of the disturbing scenes throughout this movie. Of course, those who've seen the film know that this violence is done in service of teaching a moral lesson of anti-war, showing the ugliness and the death and devastation that war causes. For me, this is much different from the violence that we see in something like the Saw franchise, which, if you're familiar with it, is really just glorification and violence for violence sake. While it may be more difficult to find examples of tasteful nudity within media, I think it is important to at least consider examples of nudity that aren't necessarily pornographic. examples that we may find in foreign films from places like France or Africa. Obviously, these things should be taken at one's own discretion and convictions. But I just wanted to talk about ways that generalizing our media consumption isn't always the best approach. The second approach is more difficult, but I believe it allows us to more easily navigate as Christians throughout a world that is constantly bombarding us with different forms of media, oftentimes non-Christian media. As Christians, our identity and our view of the world around us should always come from the one true media of the gospel, the great story of our salvation brought to us through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. When we treat that media like a sponge and let it affect everything that we do in our words and in our actions, then we can better engage with the media around us and measure how well it fits with the one true media we've been confronted with in Christ. While this is an interesting topic that I could talk more about, maybe we could unpack it more in the future, I do want to move on to the issue of social media. Today it's become almost impossible to avoid social media entirely because so much of what we do is based on these various social media platforms. But the challenge posed to the church today in response to the information that we have about social media is, what are we using social media for? What are we seeking to get out of our social media use? And how is the presentation of ourselves on social media reflecting the light of Christ within each of us? Now, to be clear, I'm not a mind reader, and I can't judge someone's motivations for making a particular post or posting a certain picture. But I think if we were each being honest with ourselves, and by us I mean those who use social media on a frequent basis, we would acknowledge that a lot of our social media consumption is self-serving. Social media is a platform designed for us to express our individuality and to show the world who we are on strictly our terms. While there's nothing necessarily wrong with this on the surface, it causes us to dwell on how other people perceive us. And too much of that isn't always healthy. If we're using social media as a means to show the world that we are this or that kind of person, a smart person, an attractive person, a compassionate person, then I think that might be an indication that we need to pause and evaluate our motivations for using social media to begin with. Or, and I hope this doesn't strike a nerve with too many of our listeners, but if you're spending a lot of time on social media writing these long essays with paragraphs about politics or theology or whatever else, then I think it's worth asking yourself what you hope to get out of all that time you're investing in ranting, as they call it, on social media. Are you, on one hand, concerned about this topic in a way that you want to share it with other people and express your viewpoints respectfully? Or, on the other hand, are you wanting to one-up your liberal relative or your Calvinist Facebook friend? If we are investing all of our identity in how we present ourselves on social media and how we interact with other people on this platform, then I think we're only setting ourselves up for failure and disappointment. Because the great secret of social media is nobody is exactly who they present themselves as on their profile. Nobody uploads their failures onto social media. Nobody posts a selfie of their reaction to a crisis in their life. When we compare ourselves to these profiles that we see on social media and try to present ourselves in the same way, then all we're doing is just trying to create a fictional version of ourselves. There's nothing wrong or sinful about using social media for the simple things like uploading pictures of our family vacation or staying in touch with relatives. But because of how the majority of vocal users have been using these platforms, and because of the culture that's been created around social media, it is worth recognizing the potential for danger of creating a dependence that should be invested in Christ and not in our own self-identity. Well, this is going to be one of our shorter episodes because we have a surprise new weekly segment starting tomorrow morning. So be sure to check back tomorrow morning for some brand new content. This will hopefully be fun and educational. But until then, we hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care and God bless.